Well, good evening, everyone. It's good to see everyone here tonight. A couple of quick housekeeping things before we jump into Daniel chapter 11. Something that I forgot to tell Jeff to announce for the men next Saturday, not this Saturday, next Saturday, June 1st, we will be having our men's morning class on Disciplines of a Godly Man. If you're curious on what chapter it is posted in the back. And then also, I believe it should be posted in the back. If it's not, for those of you wondering what's going to be coming next quarter on Sunday nights, I will also be teaching that. It'll be the second half of Ephesians that we didn't cover back in October. So it'll be chapters 4, 5, and 6 of Ephesians. Now, with all that out of the way, a little bit of what we talked about last week. Last week we were, for those of you that were not here or need a little bit of a refresher, we finished up a couple of verses at the end of Daniel chapter 10 to show that chapter 11 is the beginning of what Gabriel's message, what he had been entrusted or commanded by God to reveal to Daniel. And in chapter 11 we see a historical timeline, essentially. We start in the first 4 verses by looking at the end of the Medo-Persian Empire and moving into the rise of Alexander the Great. And then really the rest of the chapter is, we see 2 characters throughout chapter 11. Anyone remember what they are? We have 2 kings that are mentioned. Right, we have the king of the north and the king of the south, and they are representative of what? The Ptolemies and the Seleucids, yes. Essentially, we see that the king in the north is the Seleucid Empire, and the king in the south is the Ptolemaic or Ptolemies or the Ptolemaic Empire. The point that we wanted to emphasize was because it just says king in the north, king in the south, that is more of a title. That is not one particular person, because as we looked at last week exhaustively, there's actually a lot of details that God gives through the angel Gabriel and to Daniel that fit very specifically with events that happen in that particular time after Alexander the Great dies, and we get into the rise of the northern and the southern kingdoms, the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. And a lot of these things, like the marriage there being a marriage alliance and then it being broken, and there being a poisoning, and all these sorts of little details that seem to have such specificity that we can find exact representations in that time period in history. And we're not going to go back through a lot of the details, but if we jump down to about where we left off as Antiochus Epiphanes, or Antiochus IV, was beginning to reign after his brother did a very poor job and was removed from being king. And where we left off is around verse 32-ish. And we're actually going to pick up in verse 29 just as a refresher. But we saw that really there's all this chaos going on. And who's right in the middle of this power struggle between these two nations? Israel. The Israelites are going to be right in the middle of this. In fact, Jerusalem itself in Israel will change hands multiple times as the sort of national lines are drawn and redrawn. And we'll actually see this again tonight. It's a pivotal point of travel between the Ptolemaic Empire and the Seleucid Empire. And so the Jews are in this middle of this tumult, the middle of this essentially multi-pronged wars that are called the Syrian Wars. And the whole point of this, as we talked about last week, is to give them confidence that God is in control, and that God knows this is happening and that this is an expectation for them to have. Do not fret about these wars and tumults that are going to happen in the future because God is in control. Now, specifically with Antiochus, as we sort of look at the timeline and see some of the hallmarks of him coming to power, as we mentioned, he comes to power in a very dubious way. He does through deception and guile, and as well as political maneuvering. And really from verse 22 onwards, where he is introduced as the king of the north, through the rest of this chapter, he is the focus in a large part as the king of the north. And so we'll pick up here tonight, starting in verse 29. Let's see. Micah Papillon, would you mind reading for me verses 29 through 35, please? Thank you. Okay, so I know a couple of these verses we talked about last week. We see that Antiochus tries to go south, or the king in the south, or king in the north, tries to go south. See, this is why it's confusing, king in the north, king in the south. Anyway, the king in the north tries to go south. He is stopped because of some ships that will come against him. Kittim, you don't really need to know this, but as an interesting point of trivia, most likely it is referring to one of the islands in the middle of the Mediterranean, more than likely Cyprus. And it is one of those interesting third parties, as we talked about, that comes in and sort of asserts themselves in the middle of this Greek conflict that causes one of the two kings to turn back from fully conquering the other. So during this time, not only does this happen, but on the eastern border of Greece, there is a little bit of a rebellion that's beginning to form, but that's sort of ignored for a couple of years. But what's interesting, if we look at verse 30, he became enraged at the Holy Covenant and take action, so he will come back and show regard for those who forsake the Holy Covenant. Forces from him will arise, desecrate the sanctuary fortress, and do away with the regular sacrifice, and they will set up the abomination of desolation. Now, have we heard something like this before? If we remember back to chapter 8, in chapter 8 is the first time that we see the phrase abomination of desolation, and it's in reference to the little horn that comes up from the goat when the horn is split in the fours. There's a little horn that comes up afterwards, and it says that that horn will essentially pit himself against God and the people of Jehovah and will set up an abomination of desolation and will cease the sacrifices. We once again see that, and as a reminder for anyone who can remember, the goat and the horns represented what physical kingdom in Daniel chapter 8. It was, no, not the Medo-Persians. That was the ram. The goat was representative of Greece. So we're still talking about essentially the remnants of the Greek Empire as it split up. And now we see once again here in verse 31 this idea of the abomination of desolation. Now, does anyone remember, or just from reading this text, what does it seem like the abomination of desolation might be? Yes, Carol. A desecration of the temple. Okay. Anyone else? Destruction of Jerusalem. That's possible. But I believe, in my opinion, I believe Carol is right. So we see in verse 31, they go in and they desecrate the sanctuary fortress. That's clearly a reference to Jerusalem. That is the sanctuary. God's house is there. And then they do away with the regular sacrifice, again pointing us towards the temple. And then in the temple, something is done, or at least in the same sentence as it's referring to the temple, it says, then they shall prepare or set up the abomination of desolation. Now, we've talked about this before, but as a very quick refresher, because I do not expect everyone to remember every word that comes out of my mouth, shockingly, is during the intertestamental period, or those 400 years of silence, depending on what you want to call it, Antiochus Epiphanes, or Antiochus IV, goes into Jerusalem, is frustrated with the Jews because they are resisting his desire to Hellenize or to turn essentially the Jewish culture into the Greek culture. And in order to put the biggest nail he can in the foundation of Jewish culture, which is their relationship to God, to Jehovah, he goes into the temple and he sets up an altar and he slaughters a pig in the altar that is inside of the temple in Jerusalem, the temple that has been relatively newly rebuilt. And he goes in, he sets up this altar, sacrifices a pig on it, and then leaves all sorts of symbols of other idols, as well as a pig's head. Well, some stories, it's not 100% clear whether or not he did this, but some historians believe that he even left pieces of pig carcass all around the temple to defile it. That is, if you were a Jewish person, does that fit the idea of an abomination of desolation? Janine? Yep. Yeah, there's a large defilement that goes on. One of the things that, what was that, Carol?
I said they also destroyed some of the books of the law. If they could find them,
If they found the books of the law, they would burn them, because if we get rid of literature, then we get rid of history. If we can get rid of history, history is whatever we say it is. And if we say that, well, actually, Israel was not victorious because of their God, but they were victorious because XYZ reasons, because of luck. Well, if there's no written history to prove it, and then all of the inundation of records is provided from one source, people will begin to believe that, because that which is written is a very stable part of how we really look at the past, and then how the past informs our present. And Larry, if you want to correct me or step in on any of this, as the one who would probably have a better point on this than I would, feel free. But there was so many multi-levels of how Antiochus was trying to destroy every part of the Jewish culture. Their religion, their statehood, their history, all of it being defiled. And the statement and the exclamation point of that defilement was within the temple. Now, the reason I want to camp on this for a moment, excuse me, throat is getting a little dry. The reason I wanted to sort of emphasize this is some of you may disagree on it being this specific moment in time. But there is something that I think many of us can agree that it is not. Some will look at this abomination of desolation and say the one that sets this up is some sort of antichrist, and that this is coming in the far, far future from even now, that we're waiting for this sign still to be fulfilled. Which is odd to me, because we see such a clear historical record up until verse 29. But there are some who would look at verse 29 and say, oh, that's actually a transition from us talking about things that are happening between the king in the north and the king in the south in the time of Greece, and we skip all the way into the far, far, far future. And so when they get to verses 31, 32, 33, and 34, and 35, oh, well, this is speaking of some sort of antichrist. Someone who makes war with the people of God, stops the sacrifices, or stops the people of God from worshiping and makes war with them, turns the whole world against the people of God, and that it's not a Greek king or something that is set within the timeline, but this one section is apart from everything else we've been reading. Now, to be fair, we saw that very much in chapter 10, chapter 9, where in two sentences, we would go from something 70 years in history all the way to something that is in the time of Christ. So that wouldn't be out of the norm, but what's odd is this whole prophecy, and feel free to disagree with me if you would like, but it would seem that this whole prophecy is very linear, and showing this timeline from the end of Persia to Greece, and yet in the middle, suddenly we're talking about hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of years in the future, talking about end times things with some sort of antichrist that's going to set up an abomination of desolation upon earth. And people will use this in conjunction with Revelation, saying, see, Daniel is talking about what's going to happen in Revelation. But I'm curious if that's something that you see here. Janine?
In Matthew, Christ told them that they would see the abomination of desolation in Matthew 24. They would see it.
Yeah, some will think of that as the destruction of Jerusalem. But sticking here in Daniel, is there anyone who thinks that this could be talking about something besides a historical look, and that there's something more far-flung with this particular section? Is there any evidence that I'm missing? If you think I'm wrong, tell me. Is there some evidence here that we're missing? Jessica.
I don't think so, because I honestly can't see how they can interpret it as a separation, because to me it's a continuous thing of what we're already talking about. So in my mind, those who would try to make it separate are basically really trying to misinterpret it on purpose just to make their point. Because it's clear that it's still talking about it in the historical text, that it's the same time period. There's no break or anything like that. It's a continuous theme.
There's no break, there's nothing that shows in the secular history, and what you're saying is that this seems, if someone's going to interpret it that way, that they have to sort of do a backwards interpretation and interpret Daniel in a vacuum, just taking that section out and ignoring the rest of the context.
They have to be ignoring everything else in order to be even trying to think of it as a separate interpretation.
Yeah, to think of it as separate, they have to ignore all the rest of the context of the chapter. Anyone else? Vance. Well, no, that's perfect. After we look at verse 36, 39, and then after verse 39, and we get to verse 40, all of a sudden, like Vance is saying, we're back to talking about the kingdom north and kingdom south. Why just this chunk do all of a sudden we say is a huge time skip? Seems very odd. And again, it's not unprecedented in the book of Daniel, but that prophecy in chapter 9, and I'm saying this in case anyone runs into this argument, let's turn back to chapter 9 real quick. In chapter 9, verses 24 through 27, Daniel is receiving an answer to the prayer that he gives from the angel Gabriel. And Gabriel comes to him and says, I'm here to give you an answer to your prayer. And starting in verse 24. And Daniel's whole prayer is what's going to happen, or is entreating God to bring the Jewish people back from captivity earlier than the 70 years that is prophesied in Jeremiah, that their time of suffering is done, and there's an overall question of what's going to happen to the Jewish nation for the future. Keeping that context in mind, let's see. Jeff Marshall, would you mind reading verses 24 through 27, please?
Chapter 9?
Yes.
70 weeks have been decreed for your people and your holy city to finish the transgression, to make an end of sin, to make atonement for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. So you are now, so you are to know and discern that from the issue of the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah descends, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. It will be built again with the plows at their most, even in the times of distress. Thereafter, the 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing, and the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. And its end will come with a flood. Even to the end there will be war, dissolution, or determined. And he will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering. And on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate even until they complete the destruction. One that is his decree is poured out on one who makes desolate.
Thank you. Okay. So we're not going to go back through the whole interpretation of this section. We did that a couple of weeks ago. What I want to highlight is, again, we see here a few times where all of a sudden it switches time frames very quickly. We're talking 70 weeks for them to go back to Jerusalem and rebuild in verse 25. And then once the temple is rebuilt in 7 weeks and 62 weeks, the Messiah, the Prince, will come. Now, why in context would this seem a lot different than what we're reading in chapter 11? Let me ask you this. Let me ask the question in a different way. Is there a difference in specificity or specific detail between chapter 9 and chapter 11? Yes, Jessica.
Well, chapter 9 is giving basically a description of what's going to happen in the future. Like, it's more vague, I would see, than it is in chapter 11. Chapter 11 is much more detailed, much more specific to a nearer future, versus chapter 9, the 70 weeks prophecy. That's years and years in the future, and from what my commentary says, even predicting when Jesus is going to be born. And so that's a much different prophecy than what's happening. So one is coming much sooner, so it's more specific. One is way ahead, and it's more vague.
Very well said. We see, as Jessica was just saying, we see here there's a lot more vagueness in chapter 9 because we see a huge chunk of the future being explored here, all the way to the coming of the Messiah, to the possible birth of Christ, as one of the interpretations here that we talked about in chapter 9. But yet when we get to chapter 11, there is so much more specific detail that we can find confirmed in secular history, whereas with this, we have all these weeks that we know are not literal weeks, and all this time from the temple being rebuilt to the time of the Messiah, and then something happening with the Messiah, the prince, and then some desolation unto the end. We see that phrase. And this is only covered in 4 verses. This is much more broad and vague versus, if we turn back to chapter 11, we have, before we even get to the big verse on which we're camping on, in verse 31, we have 30 other verses that lead up to that showing specific events in history. If someone challenges us and says, well, how is this, God, it wouldn't be unlike God in Daniel to really show a quick changing of time, but yet the example of that in chapter 9 is a very specific prophecy. It's given for this reason of answering Daniel's question, and it's covered in a very different way and presented in a very different way. And I hope that's something understandable and at least visually for us to be able to see, so that we can make that point to say, well, these prophecies are in 2 very different contexts. The point of the message in chapter 9 and the point of the message that we see so far in chapter 11 are 2 very different things. And I hope that's crystal clear for you all listening to this. Any other comments before we move on? Yeah, Vance.
Looking at the connection, verse 35 is in this portion, which maybe has a question mark on it, right? Could this be later on, or is this, are we switching back and forth? But 35, you have this line, in order to refine, purge, and make it impure until the end time.
Mm-hmm.
And then we go to 40, where we go back to king of the north and king of the south, and that verse starts with at the end time. And so to me, the connection just between 35 and 40 is pretty devastating against the argument of, well, now this is something different. So I think it's even proof within the passage itself.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. That again, that we have this clear difference in the reading of verse 35 to 40, where we're talking about something specific, and then we jump to something specific again, to the king of the north and the king of the south. But that's a great setup, Vance, because I want us to talk about continuing forward in verses 30 through 35. What exactly the Jewish people are experiencing or going to experience. Those who have insight among the people will gain understanding to the many, yet they will fall by sword and by flame, by captivity and by plunder for many days. Now when they fall, they will be granted little help, and many will join them in hypocrisy. Some of those who have insight will fall in order to refine, purge, and make them pure until the end time, because it is still to come at the appointed time. We'll stop there. We see this phrase repeated in this section a few different times. Those who have insight. We see that as well in verse 33 and 32. What do you think that means, those who have insight? What is that referring to in this context? Spiritually wise. It's a very pithy way of saying that. Yes, those who are spiritually wise, those who still hold to God. Carol, your hand was up.
Those that refuse to succumb to his demands that they stop following law. They stood firm in their belief to follow law.
Very, very well said, yes. Those who stand firm in their belief to refuse to follow the law. Did I see another hand? Or am I going crazy? I'm going crazy. Okay. Exactly. So we see that those who have insight, those who refuse to Hellenize, those who refuse to do what Antiochus desires and bow to the Greek rule and forsake God, they will refuse. But what will happen to them, according to the verses we just read? What was that? Someone said something. They will fall by the sword. Exactly. There is a promise that those that follow after God, that do the right thing and stand for the truth, some of them will fall. Some of them are not going to make it to the end of this crisis. Now, we've talked about the Maccabean revolt in brief before, and if that's something you want to look at, all that text, the first and second Maccabees, is available for free online with a quick Google search. It's a very interesting story. Highly encourage, if you're curious in this, read that. That's about those who refuse and rebel against the Greeks, and that's called the Maccabean Revolt or the Maccabean Rebellion. And they cleanse the temple and they do all of these things, but yet this is a war. Some of them fall and some of them die. And yet we are told some of those who have insight will fall in order to refine, purge, and make them pure until the end time, because it is still to come at the appointed time. Now, the end time, we should be very familiar with that phrase because we hear it a lot in the Gospels and the New Testament. Christ says that the end times are near. And then in after the Gospels, we see that we are in the end times. The end time referring to the time that we see at the end of the prophecy in Daniel chapter 2, when the kingdom of God will be established, when the mountain will grow. But up until that point, the Jews are going to be what? Those that are faithful will be refined, purged, and make them pure. Now, is there anything here that we can think of that that we can find application to us today? I mean, go ahead, Jessica.
In this time period today, as we know, there's nothing new that we're going through that they haven't gone through themselves. But we're facing our own troubles in this time period where Christianity is not popular. It's difficult to be a Christian. So we are going through our own time period of where we're going to be refined and purified as well. It's just a different form of it.
Okay, different form of it. We in this time are going to be refined and purified as we face our own version of persecution. Okay, anyone else have any other possible application? Well, let's think of it this way too, kind of taking what Jessica said. We look at we look at this and we see that the people of God are going to suffer because they decide to stand for the truth. We see this in Revelation as well, that there are those that will fall, Revelation chapter 20, those that have fallen or been beheaded in their service to Christ and have been beheaded because they remain faithful to Christ. There's an assurance that they will be in heaven with Christ. That's a paraphrase. But we can see that in Revelation 20, that there's again this guarantee that yes, brethren will fall. There are those that follow God that are going to suffer from the hands of man. This is a repeatable part of history, and it's a guarantee. It's something that we see in the Old Testament and the New Testament. It's not just something that Christ invents in the Beatitudes when he says, blessed are those who suffer for my name's sake and are persecuted for my name's sake. This is something that God's saying in the Old Testament as well. It's a consistency. Something that I love to see, that always is fascinating to me, is when we can see these consistencies that seem like, oh, brand new ideas that are made in the New Testament, but yet these principles still exist in the Old. And it is, for me, an encouragement, because it sets this precedent that no matter how bad the world gets, no matter what wars and kingdoms, revolts, no matter what the country that we might live in decide to do, whoever's in power, what will endure? Those that are faithful to God. There's an endurance. They will be refined. They will have to suffer a little. Difficult times will come, but at the end of the day, and we'll talk about this when we get to the end of the chapter, evil will not have victory, and the people of God will have victory. Those that have insight will receive reprieve. They are, for a short amount of time, going to have to suffer at the hands of evil. But there is a temporariness to that. And that's something that I think we can read and find that consistency throughout history. That is an encouragement for us. I know we've been talking about this a lot lately in class, but this really brings it, I think, to a fine point. A lot of people wonder what's going to happen in the church in 20, 30, 40, 50 years, when some of you in this room probably won't be here anymore. Well, what's going to happen? What's going to happen to the church? Well, it'll still be here. If the earth is here, which I can't guarantee, but if the earth is still here, the church will still be here. There will still be those, no matter how bad things get, there will always be those in societies that have insight and that will turn towards God even when the punishment is severe for doing so. And it sets my mind at ease personally to remember this, as frustrating and as scary as things could seem for the church. Just like with Israel, and just like really people that are faithful to God, there will always be those that find the truth. There will always be those that seek and will find God's insight and will refuse to quote 1 Kings chapter 19, refuse to bow the knee to Baal. So, hopefully that's something that is an encouragement to you as well. I want to continue forward, cover a couple of points here before we end the chapter. There's a little bit, something that we didn't read. Let's pick up in verse 36. Then the king will do as he pleases, and he will exalt and magnify himself above every god, and will speak monstrous things against the gods, and he will prosper until the indignation is finished. For that which is decreed will be done. He will show no regard for the gods of his fathers, or for the desire of women, nor will he show regard for any other god. For he will magnify himself above them all. But instead he will honor a God of fortress, a God whom his fathers did not know. He will honor him with gold, silver, costly stones, and treasures. He will take action against the strongest of fortresses with the help of a foreign god. He will give great honor to those who acknowledge him, and will cause them to rule over the many, and will parcel out land for a price. Again, we see more about this ruler, more than likely Antiochus, and how he is thinking of himself as a god, is boastful. Again, things that we see in chapter 8. But also we're not going to spend really any more time on this, but verse 39, it references a foreign god. There's some debate over what that exactly means, whether some say that it could be a god that is foreign to the Jews, so that's a foreign god from the Jewish perspective, from Daniel's perspective, or that it's a foreign god to the Greeks, possibly that he's serving one of the Roman pantheon, which some of you might say, wait, aren't they the same thing? Yes, but no, not at this time. They're seen as very different, even though they function much the same. Anyhow, that's just something some of you might see in your commentaries or in your texts. But the point is that he thinks of himself as a god. He is an arrogant man. He makes war with the people of God. And then we see he's given victory, though. We look at as we saw in verse 38, or verse 37. For he will magnify himself above all, or verse 36, excuse me. He will prosper until the indignation is finished, for that which is decreed will be done. He's ruling at the behest and allowance of whom? This is all part of God's plan. He rules and does these things because he is allowed to by God. Because when the time is over, the time is over. Autumn, would you mind reading for me verses 40 through 45, please?
At the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him. The
Thank you. So, if you want to see some of the history that is coinciding here, this is the Sixth Syrian War, the last one, as it says in verse 40, at the end time. And I put a short little summary of some of the things that happen secularly, if you want to look at that on the sheet for tonight. But I just want to focus on two quick things. Verse 45, the very end of verse 45. Yet he will come to his end, and no one will help him. Does that keep that in mind, keep your finger there, highlighted on he will come to his end and no one will help him, which of course is referring to his death. And then look at verse 40. Does that statement make something a little more clear about what the first part of verse 40? Because what are we seeing in the first part of verse 40 that could be confusing to some? At the time of the end. Now, one could read that at first glance and think, oh, the end of the world, Armageddon. But when we read verse 45, whose end is it? His, the king in the north's end. It is at his end that the king of the south will attack, and then he will go north, defeat the king in the south, will counterattack southward, gain a whole bunch of treasure, then we'll have to go home, and then he's going to fight. And in verse 45, at some point between Mount Horeb or Mount Sinai, whichever you want to call it, the holy mountain, he will come to an end. Between that and the sea, somewhere in that area of the world, which is in modern-day Iran, somewhere in there, the king in the north, Antiochus, will come to his end, which tells us that verse 40 is not talking about the end of the times, but rather the end of the king in the north, because that's how language works. That sets that very clear in context. It starts with his end in that section, and then we see his final end, his death, in verse 45. Jessica.
I was looking up, it says that he got sick and he died. That's what they say happened to him, but it's like, it's interesting because just that he died in the scriptures, and then if he got sick, don't help him with that.
Yeah, there's a lot of theories in that day and time that he was divinely smitten with some sort of mysterious disease and died, or some say that he just fell in a battle. It doesn't really matter as far as his time was appointed by God, his time ended, and thus it ended. And again, we see the control that God has of this whole situation. Now, next week, we will finish this study by going into chapter 12. And chapter 12 is when we do get to some more far-flung future events. And while verse 12 might seem more esoteric, it's almost easier to divine because we can kind of see some of the vague symbolism there a little more clearly. Now, before we end, are there any comments or questions? Because I know we've covered a lot in the last 2 weeks. And if there's any comments or questions before we end this chapter, I would love to address them. I'm sorry, Carol. I got to take a step back so you're more in my peripheral.
The book of Maccabees, which is in the Apocrypha.
Yes.
It's really helpful to read that. I realize it's not inspired, but it does give you a historical account of the same events that you're studying here. It kind of goes into more detail as to all the things that happened.
Yeah, the first and second Maccabees, as Carol was saying, are apocryphal books. They're not inspired, but they do give a lot of insight into the things that we're seeing here in chapter 11, and there is some useful from a historical and giving more context to chapter 11. They are useful for those points. Anything else? Keep feeling like I'm missing a hand somewhere. All right, seeing none else, let us go ahead and end in a closing word of prayer. Nolan Papillon, would you mind leading us in a closing word of prayer? Amen.